So I have something of a different kind of video today. Usually in my videos, I summarize the ideas of famous philosophers like Aristotle or Augustine or Thomas Aquinas, and sometimes I'll put these thinkers in dialogue with more modern thinkers, usually through the lens of trying to prove a theistic worldview. But today I'm going to do something different, because today I have an argument that I've been working on for the last several weeks. It's an argument for moral realism, and this is somewhat original to myself. I'm not going to claim that it's totally original, because that's not true. I mean, other philosophers have proposed similar arguments to the one that I came up with in the last few weeks, but it's kind of the most original thing I've done so far. So what I want to do in this video is go over this argument. I want to present it to you, and I want you guys to give me feedback on it, because it's only through getting feedback that I can make this argument stronger. And to be honest with you, the production value on this video is not going to be as high as it usually is, because I still have a lot more work on this argument before it's finalized, and I don't want to put all this work into making this video really nice and have this not be my finalized version of this argument. So in this video, I'm basically just going to be presenting enough of my paper to give you guys a gist of my argument so that you can give me some feedback on it. That's the goal. And I know you guys won't let me down on that, because if there's anything I know about my viewers, it's that you guys really like philosophy and you really like poking holes in my arguments, which is great. I love it. But this is your time to shine. This is your time to poke as many holes as you want. I want you to poke the holes. Basically, my argument for moral realism that I'm proposing in this paper says that you can show that moral realism exists from the very popularity of belief in moral realism. I spend the first half of my paper or so arguing that moral realism is near universal. Nearly everyone has an implicit belief in moral realism. Let me pull up some sections of this paper and let me show you exactly what I mean by this argument. I guess first I should probably define what I mean by moral realism. I just looked down in my paper and I saw that I had a definition there, and I haven't actually presented that to you yet. The Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy defines moral realism as the belief that moral claims do purport to report facts and are true if they get the facts right. In other words, a moral realist is someone who believes that moral statements can be factual, that moral claims can be either true or false. And alternatively, a moral non-realist, or also sometimes called a non-cognitivist, argues that truth or falsity cannot be ascribed to moral claims. Now, what I then argue is that given this definition of moral realism, it should be immediately clear how strong this position is reflected in our customary uses of moral language. So consider some following formulas for moral statements that we make all the time. You shouldn't do that. That's bad. You should do that. That's good. This punishment is unjust. There's nothing wrong with doing this. That is a good man. These kind of statements form the background for many, many, many of the moral claims we make. Yet, these claims, these statements, which aren't atypical by any means for moral claims, present themselves as factual. They present themselves as making a definitive claim about the state of the world. As I say in my paper, there is a definitiveness to the words capital punishment is wrong, which is not found in statements like capital punishment makes me feel icky, or I'm not a fan of capital punishment. A definitiveness which naturally invites the question, well, what's your reason for thinking that? This, at least, is how statements of a moral nature are usually taken. We naturally take these kind of statements as defendable on an evidential basis. So the very language we use to describe moral claims suggests an implicit belief in moral realism in the background of our moral conversations. And then I go on to argue later in this paper that the fact that we're willing to engage with these claims on a factual basis, the fact that it's considered to be a good response to the claim that capital punishment is unjust, for example, to say, well, no, here's some evidence that capital punishment is not unjust. The fact that we operate this way suggests even more so that our natural inclination is to treat moral claims as if they're grounded in fact, as if they're factual claims. Okay, we naturally assume that moral realism is true, is basically what I'm coming to at the end of that whole discussion. The question then is, how could we get from there to the idea that moral realism is true? how does everyone believing something is true mean that it is true? I mean, doesn't that just sound like the fallacy of the appeal to popular opinion? And I do say, well, hold on, the appeal to popular opinion is what you call a informal fallacy. It's not a formal fallacy. So it's not always a fallacy to appeal to popular opinion. It's only a fallacy to appeal to popular opinion if you do it in a fallacious way, if you do it in a way that breaks logical form. But if the conclusions that you're deriving from the existence of some popular opinion actually follow from the existence of that popular opinion, well, then your argument isn't fallacious. And what I propose is an argument, but I don't think is fallacious, but maybe you'll tell me that I'm wrong, for moral realism from how popularly moral realism is believed. So let's get into that. Let me turn to where I have this thing. I should mention this paper is actually part of a larger discussion I'm writing, larger paper on the moral argument for God, which is well accepted, I think, in more popular existence of God theistic circles, but isn't maybe so well regarded in more academic scholarly circles. So I'm trying to maybe change that, because I actually think there is something to this argument when proposed rightly. I think the version of the argument that I'm proposing in this paper sidesteps a lot of common objections to the moral argument for God. So that's what I'm hoping to do. But let's get into my argument for moral realism. So in order to make my argument that moral realism can be inferred from how popular belief in moral realism is, I first need to suggest a standard for knowledge. And then I'm going to suggest how that standard implies that moral realism should be accepted as true. The argument begins with a simple question. What are the limits of philosophy? And I'm not really interested here in what is beyond the capacity of philosophy to discover, though that's a pretty interesting question, but what is beyond the capacity of philosophy to doubt? After all, there's been a lot of philosophical thinkers like Descartes or Hume or Berkeley who have said, well, philosophy can doubt anything. And that leads them to a kind of skepticism. And actually it leads them to a kind of skepticism about super basic things, like whether or not objects outside of ourselves exist, whether or not other minds exist. And the question we have to ask is, do we really want to go there in our philosophy? Do we really want to doubt super basic parts of our experience? Because honestly, that kind of makes philosophy a little weird. So maybe we just say that if something is revealed by common sense, then it can't be doubted by philosophy. Now, I'm not going to go that far, because there's a problem with that too. Because that seems to put something above reason. And it seems a little weird to make a rational argument for putting something above reason, because you're using reason to get to reason, and that's not good. So we're left with a dilemma. We want to give reason a primary role in determining what we hold to be true, but we don't want to risk opening the door to radical skepticism about our most fundamental experiences. In light of this dilemma, I'm going to propose a particular epistemological method, so a method of how we know things, as a solution. What I will suggest is this is what I read in my paper, is the modest claim that when there are two plausible theories for a position, one which is supposed by common experience and another which is not, the common sense one ought to be preferred over the unintuitive one. So if you have a tie between an unintuitive position and an intuitive one, choose the intuitive one. Common sense may not be flawless, but without it, philosophy becomes, I already said this, but for lack of a more technical term, weird. It becomes extremely disconnected from how ordinary people think and operate. On this basis, I suggest the following principle be accepted. The more integral a belief is to the common human experience, the more reluctant philosophers should be to cast doubt on it. If a position has been believed by nearly every human being who has ever lived, and seems to be held naturally on the basis of instinct and intuition, and not through the influence of society alone, then it ought to be treated with the highest degree of reverence, and dismissed only when we are confronted with a high degree of evidence against it. If a commonly held position is less universal, or less a matter of natural instinct and more a matter of societal convention, then it should still be given preferential treatment, but not to the same extent as the more universal and integral beliefs. This, I believe, is a good compromise. It allows reason to have the final say, but understands that philosophy, in order to not become too divorced from how ordinary people think, must take into account those most deeply held positions and overturn them only when absolutely necessary. So basically, what I'm arguing is that we should give positions supported by common sense. And by common sense, I don't just mean everyone kind of happens to think it, but everyone seems to think it at this deep down fundamental level that's ingrained in human nature and we don't seem to be able to escape. We should give those kind of positions a epistemological head start. We should assume that they're correct unless there's a lot of evidence to prove otherwise. They're innocent until proven guilty. And what I argue in the rest of this paper is that given what I just said about moral realism a minute ago and how it seems to be ingrained in our natural ways of thinking, and given that I later argue there doesn't seem to be any good argument against moral realism. In this paper, actually, I engage with two arguments that have been presented by J.L. Mackey against moral realism, and I show why they fail. If you want to see those arguments, I'm actually going to post this paper to my Substack. So when I'm done with it. So you can see those arguments there. If you go to my Substack, Philosophy of Common Sense, it's on Substack. That's where you find my Substack. I'll have a link to it below. You can see this whole paper that I'm presenting, at least the part on moral realism. But putting that together, putting this idea that there's no arguments against moral realism, and, well, moral realism seems to be supported by common sense, and given this standard that I proposed where something which is supported by common sense should be assumed to be true unless there's good arguments against it, then we can say moral realism should be assumed to be true because there's no good arguments against it and it's supported by common sense. So the conclusion I arrive at the end of this argument is that moral realism is true. Thank you for watching this video.